The Veth Crossing had already swallowed 3 drakes by the time Mara Dunn pressed her weight forward into the saddle and felt Veth shudder beneath her. Not from fear. Veth didn't fear. The shudder was wrong, a catch in his left wing stroke, a fraction of a second too short, and she felt it the way she felt her own heartbeat, not as something external but as something wrong inside herself. 11 years bonded to a war drake taught you to read the body beneath you like a second skin. Below them, smoke rose from the valley in 3 columns. 3 columns meant 3 drakes down. The Korathi pack had come through the pass faster than the scouts reported and hit the formation before the Veth riders could split and scatter. Mara had watched Dunnell's drake take the blast from the east flank and fold. She had watched old Sarat go inverted and not come back up. She had not watched the third because she'd been in a roll herself, Veth pulling them up and away from a slab of expelled energy that had scorched the air where her leg had been. Commander Barath's voice cut through her earpiece, clipped, flat, the tone he used when orders were not negotiable. "Done. Break off. Get to the Rithvar line." "Acknowledged," she said, and did not break off. Veth's left wing caught again. She put her hand on his neck, flat-palmed, and felt the tension there, the muscular compensation he was already making, the way a runner favors a knee without knowing it. She leaned out of the saddle far enough to see the trailing edge of his left membrane, and what she saw made her stomach drop. A tear, not small, starting at the 4th rib spar and running toward the tip, maybe 30 centimeters, the edge already beginning to fray with the wind pulling at it. If it propagated to the spar joint, the whole membrane would flag. At altitude, in turbulence with the Korathi still in the pass, a flagging wing meant a spinning descent. It meant the end of Veth. "Barath, I have a membrane tear left wing," she said. "I can't safely break off." A pause. In that pause she could hear the commander calculating whether she was lying, whether she was brave or stupid, whether she was both. "How bad?" "Bad enough." Another pause, shorter. "Can he hold altitude?" She pressed her hand harder against Veth's neck and felt him answer, not in words. The bond didn't work in words, but in something more like intention, a gathering, a refusal to concede. He could hold altitude, for now. "Yes," she said, "he can hold." "Then get to the Rithvar line and set down. Don't let it propagate." "Understood." She didn't mention that getting to the Rithvar line meant crossing 4 kilometers of open sky that the Korathi Pass still had eyes on. She didn't mention it because Barath knew and was choosing not to say it, and that was a mercy she was willing to accept. She brought Veth into a low glide, reducing his stroke frequency, taking the load off the damaged membrane. He adjusted immediately, not because she'd commanded it, but because he felt what she felt. The bond ran both ways and always had. 11 years had made them into something that wasn't quite 2 separate creatures. The Korathi struck again from the east. Not at her, at the empty air where Commander Barath had been. She caught the flash of discharge, and then Barath's drake was rolling, pulling, climbing out of it, alive. She had 4 kilometers of open sky and a dragon with a fraying membrane. She pushed Veth into a steeper angle, trading altitude for speed, reducing time in the open. He went with her without hesitation. The wind hit the tear and she heard it, not loud, just a hiss like cloth starting to split, and she did the thing she'd been calculating since she'd first seen it. A second discharge came from behind, close enough that the air cracked. She didn't flinch, there wasn't time, but she felt Veth flinch under her, a single convulsive tightening of his whole back, and she heard herself say his name even though she knew he could hear her better through the bond than through her voice. The Korathi hadn't broken off. One of them was still tracking her, had decided she was the easier target, the one flying in a straight glide instead of dodging. She couldn't dodge, not with the membrane compromised, not at this angle. She pressed flat against Veth's neck and let him feel the choice. Straight through, as fast as he could push, no more maneuver. He responded with a surge she felt in her chest, his back legs drawing in, wings pulling harder in shorter, faster strokes, driving them forward with everything he had. She heard the membrane hissing behind her. She didn't look. The third discharge hit the stone of the pass wall 30 meters to her right. The Korathi was adjusting his aim, walking his shots toward her. She counted the interval, 3 seconds between discharges, maybe 4, and she knew she had one interval before he corrected, and the next one wouldn't miss the same way. "Come on," she said to Veth. Not a command, just the two of them acknowledging what was happening. He poured on more speed. She had not known he had more 11 years, and she had not known he had this much left in reserve. The fourth discharge came as they crossed the midpoint of the open sky, close enough that she felt the heat on the back of her left hand. It missed. The Korathi broke off after that. She didn't see why and didn't have time to look. She didn't care. She was inside 2 kilometers and Veth was still flying. She pulled her knife. Not a weapon. A strap knife, blunt-tipped, for cutting harness in an emergency. She leaned out of the saddle on the left side as far as the tether would allow, and she was not calm and she was not heroic, and her hands were shaking from the cold at this altitude, and from the adrenaline still moving through her from the first pass. She reached the membrane. The tear was worse up close. The fraying edge was already catching air in little flutters that told her the propagation had started. She didn't have time for a proper repair. What she had was her tether, her knife, and the repair cord she kept wrapped around her left wrist because her instructor at the Veth training post had told her once, years ago, that you never flew without it, and she had never once, in 11 years, needed to believe him. She needed to believe him now. She cut the cord free from her wrist in 3 quick passes, 20 meters of braided nymph fiber, rated for 100 kilos of tension. She pressed herself against Veth's side, hooking her left knee over the saddle cantle, and she began to stitch. It was not elegant. It was not anything they'd taught her. She drove the knife tip through the membrane's edge above the tear, pulled a loop of cord through the hole, crossed to the other side, drove through again. Veth held his angle precisely, and she understood, in some part of herself that had no words, that he was doing it deliberately, holding the membrane as still as he could, damping his stroke, taking more load on his right wing so she'd have a stable surface to work on. He couldn't feel the cord passing through his membrane the way she'd feel a needle. But he could feel what she was doing through the bond, and he was helping. She stitched 8 loops before her fingers went too numb to continue. At some point during the stitching, Veth had begun a low, steady vibration through his ribs. Not a growl, not distress. Something that traveled up through the saddle and into her body. A sound she'd felt before when he was at full extension in a long glide, when the world below was very far away, and the air above was clean. She understood it was deliberate. He was steadying her the way she was steadying him, each one holding the other in the only way they had left, and she drove the last loop through the membrane and knotted it and pressed her palm flat against the repair and felt the cord hold. The repair wasn't clean. The membrane would carry a scar. She'd been told a repaired membrane always told on itself in cold air, a small stiffness that the drake could feel but the rider usually couldn't. She hauled herself back into the saddle, her whole left side burning, and thought it was fine. Whatever Veth carried for the rest of his life, they'd carry together. The Rithvar line appeared below, the stone-flagged landing ground on the west side of the pass, 3 ground crews waiting, Commander Barath's drake already down and folded, Barath himself standing at the edge of the pad with his arms crossed and his eyes up. Veth descended without her guidance. He knew the ground. He knew where she was tired and where she needed him to land clean, and he came down soft on all 4 feet without a stumble, the left wing folding last and carefully, protecting the repair. Mara sat in the saddle for a moment longer than she needed to. She was aware of Barath walking toward her and of the ground crews coming in from the sides and of the sound her own breathing made when the wind dropped and the pass went quiet. She was aware of Veth's heartbeat slowing under her, not back to rest, nothing like rest, but pulling away from the edge. She climbed down. The ground crew lead came first, a young man named Torvek, and he stopped when he saw the membrane. He stood there with his mouth slightly open, looking at the stitching. He had been repairing Drake membranes for 4 years, and she could tell from his face that he wasn't sure what to say about what he was seeing. "Will it hold?" she asked him. Torvek looked at her, then back at the membrane, then at her again. "It's already holding," he said. "It held you across the open." Barath reached them and he stopped at the same place Torvek had, looking at the same repair, and whatever he'd been preparing to say to her, she could tell there had been something. The set of his jaw carried it. He let it go. "You should have broken off," he said. He couldn't break off alone. Barath looked at Veth. Veth, for his part, was watching Barath with the amber-lit patience of a creature that had made its decision and had no interest in revisiting it. Barath was an experienced commander, and he knew what a war drake's expression carried when it carried anything. He looked away first. One of the ground crew, a woman Mara didn't know, older, with gray at her temples, had come to stand beside Veth at some point during the exchange. She wasn't touching him. She was just standing there, looking at the repair, and when Mara caught her eye she looked away too, quickly, the way you look away from something that asks too much of you to keep watching. "The Matriarch is at the forward post," Barath said quietly. She asked about the last pair still flying. Mara hadn't known that. She didn't know what to do with it. "I'll give you an hour," Barath said and walked away. The Matriarch of the Veth rode a drake called Orath. So old his scales had gone silver-gray at the edges, and his eyes had deepened from amber to something closer to bronze. She was sitting on a stone bench at the edge of the forward post when Mara found her, and Orath was lying beside her with his head resting on the flagstones and his eyes half closed, and the Matriarch was simply sitting with one hand resting on the top of his skull, the way you'd rest your hand on something you'd carried a long time and knew the weight of exactly. She was not a small woman. She was not a soft one. She had commanded the Veth riders for 30 years, and her face showed it, not harshly but honestly, the lines of someone who had spent decades reading weather and wind, and the thing that lived in a drake's expression when it chose to share it. Mara stopped a few paces away. She hadn't planned what to say, and she didn't say anything. The Matriarch let the silence sit without filling it, which told Mara something about the kind of person she was. Orath opened one eye, the left, the one closest to where Mara had stopped, and regarded her with the flat, direct interest of a very old creature that had decided she was not a threat and might be something else entirely. She looked at Mara and then past her to where Veth had settled, and she looked at the membrane for a long time. "Ninth cord," she said, "off your wrist." "Yes." "Done at altitude." "Yes." The Matriarch nodded once. Not approval exactly, recognition. The difference mattered. Approval was a superior saying you'd done well. Recognition was something older. The understanding of one person who had put their hands on a drake's membrane in bad air and known what it cost, looking at another. "He held his angle," the Matriarch said. "It was not a question." "The whole time." Orath lifted his head from the flagstones and turned it toward Veth with a slowness that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with weight. The considered attention of something very old looking at something it had decided was worth looking at. Veth met his gaze and held it, and the silence between the two drakes was the kind of silence that would have been uncomfortable between humans and was simply true between dragons. The Matriarch rose from the bench. She came to Mara, and she took her left hand, the one that had gone numb at altitude, the one that still carried the ghost of the cord cutting across it, and she turned it palm up and looked at the marks the braiding had left. "You'll carry this for a week," the Matriarch said. "He'll carry his for longer." "I know," Mara said. The Matriarch released her hand. She looked at her for a moment in the clear, cold light of the pass, not measuring, not deciding, just seeing. Then she turned back to Oreth and sat beside him again and put her hand back on his skull, and that was all. It was enough. Mara understood that it was enough. She walked back to where Veth waited, and she put her hand against his neck, and he pressed back, not hard, just present, the same steady pressure as his heartbeat. Around them the pass held its ordinary noise, wind moving through the stone, the ground crews working, voices calling coordinates across the landing pad. She stood with him until the cold of the stone came up through her boots, and the ache in her left side finally settled into something bearable. She didn't move to go inside. Neither did he. They had time,